It's 10 o'clock. If we don't begin now, how will people know they're late when they come in? First of all, I want to clarify a couple things I said last week about Amana before we begin. I made a joking comment that the reason that they went into refrigeration was to keep the beer cold. And somebody here asked, well, what did they do before refrigeration? It's now 2026. It's hard for us to remember that refrigerators in people's homes were not common until after World War II. The refrigerator was invented in 1910, but it wasn't until after World War II, and even into the 50s, that people had a refrigerator in their home. And the Amana Refrigeration Company grew out of this group that I'm going to be talking about, but after the period that I'm going to be referring to, because I'm really kind of cutting off my analysis of the community in 1932 when they ended their communal existence. Now, there was a Amana Society that continued afterwards, but the way that Amana Refrigeration began was in 1934, 2 years after they broke up communally. One of the men in the group, George Wooster, was a salesman for their woolen mill, took some of his own money, $3,500, and because Prohibition had ended, he figured that people would need to keep beverages cool. And so he founded the refrigeration plant in Middle Amana, which is one of the 7 villages. And 3 years later, he sold it to the Amana Society, and eventually Whirlpool got it, and the rest is history. But it began as a refrigeration company that made walk-in coolers. But it wasn't, it didn't really grow out of specifically the communal existence of Amana. It was a personal decision of one of their salesmen to invest in the future. And, but that's how it came about. Now, I'm going to be talking about the Amana Group primarily between 1850, when they came to the United States, and 1932, when they broke up, they ended their communal existence. But I need to give some background to the community, which goes back to Germany. By the way, the 7 villages, there were actually 7 villages in the Amana colonies, and the names are very hard to remember. There's Amana, West Amana, South Amana, High Amana, East Amana, Middle Amana, and Homestead. Homestead was a community that existed before the Amana community bought out Homestead, lock, stock, and barrel. And it was the first village that they had. Okay, first thing I want to say is that this group, who were a pietistic German sect that came from Germany, immigrated from Germany, we know as Amana, but their true name is the Community of True Inspiration. Amana was the chosen biblical word to name the villages because the words mean believe faithfully. But they are the Community of True Inspiration, and as their name suggests, they believed that there was a person in their midst who spoke for God to them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. They were a distinct sect from 1714 until the breakup of the community in 1932 because of the Great Depression, which ended their communal lifestyle. Okay, I want to talk about some of the moves that led to them being in the United States. First of all, they were in Germany, but they were eventually made it to Buffalo, New York, and then to Iowa, where we know them as the Amana colonies. They were about, at the maximum in 1900, about 1,800 souls, and each of the 7 villages had about as many people as the Oneida colony had. Oneida had at its max 300 people, And I think there's something self-containing about that number 300 in terms of community, in terms of the intimacy of a community. First of all, let's talk about the individuals who offered leadership, which they saw as a word from God, as if Moses himself were giving a word from God. They called these people Werkzeuge, which is German for instruments. They saw them as God's instruments. Their belief was that God spoke to the community as surely as Moses spoke to the community of his day. They were understood as they understood the person speaking under the influence of God's Spirit, and a scribe or several scribes would write down everything they said. Usually it was a moral or spiritual exhortation. Sometimes it was about a major decision the community had to make. Sometimes it was a rebuke of somebody. That's pretty stinging when God speaks, they think, against somebody. The testimonies are as short as a few sentences, or they could go on for hours. And while the Werkzeuge, the instrument, was speaking, often they were shaking and trembling. And another interesting thing about this group, in contrast to what we saw in Oneida, the community of true inspiration believed that some of these inspirational utterances could be false as well as true. And so after the Werkzeuge gave their testimony, the elders would have a confab and decide whether or not it was a true inspiration or not. And if it was, those words were treated as if they were scripture. They were treated as if they were scripture. The first inspirationists were led by Ludwig Gruber and Johann Rock, and this was in Germany. Gruber died in 1728, Rock died in 1749. The group began to decline. In the early 1800s, a tailor from Strasbourg named Michael Krausut was seen as one of these instruments, but he was soon determined not to be an instrument because when he was arrested by the authorities, he didn't show courage in facing up to the Inquisition he was under. These people in Germany were persecuted for three reasons. They refused to take an oath to the state, they refused military service, and they refused to send their children to the Lutheran schools. And they were willing to pay taxes for the children of other residents to go to public schools, but they insisted on instructing their children. So those were the three things that caused them trouble. In Germany, they moved around to several different communities to avoid persecution. They'd find a place where there was less persecution. They actually had a number of groups that were inspirationists in Germany. At this time, they were not living communally. They were not living community, but they did decide to take their meals communally. And the communal meals are an important part of their culture. And when they ended in 1932, it was a real shock to a lot of people. I told you last week about the man I interviewed who was part of the community before the breakup in 1932, and he was shocked because he never had a meal outside of a communal meal in the community. A very important figure became another instrument. His name was Christian Metz. And he began to revive the community again. Again, they experienced persecution. And in 1842, they found out that the authorities were really going to crack down. And the very day they found this out, he had an inspirational message. And it's, because it's written down, I can tell you exactly what it was. Your goal and your way shall lead you to the west, to the land which is still open to you and to your faith. I am with you and shall lead you over the sea. Hold me, call upon me through your prayers when the storms of temptation rises. Four may then prepare themselves. Now those were his actual, in German, those were his actual words. And so they picked 4 people to travel to America to find a new place for them. And before they went, they had a high communion service to celebrate and prepare to send them to New York. The four arrived in New York in October of 1842, and they found leads that led them to Buffalo, New York. Upstate New York was a place of ferment in those days, where they found that land had just been made available for white settlers on the site of the Seneca Indian Reservation. And so they purchased 5,000 acres, and 800 persons at that point immigrated to America, primarily people who were artisans. I want to stop there and just look at that one phrase. Land had just been made available for white settlers on the site of the Seneca Indian Reservation. It's important for me to remember that white settlement of the North American continent looks very differently from the Native American side. And you'll discover that when they were in the Buffalo area, they had trouble because the Seneca Indians didn't really want them there. When they go to Iowa, they are purchasing land that's just been made available to them. And you remember, Oneida had a land available from the Oneida Indians. We are all standing on ground that initially was not for Europeans. You know, we ought not to forget that. In fact, this church, when I did the history of this congregation's sanctuary, I talked about some of the conflict between Native Americans and, hi, it's okay. Some of the conflict between Native Americans and the white settlers. You need to know that after the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, which ended the Indian Wars in the Northwest Territories, there was a boundary set that went from the Cuyahoga River to now what's the Indiana border at a line that I think it's in Holmes County, isn't it?
It is.
The treaty line.
Freiburg, it's right there.
Yeah. And so we're actually sitting on land that was technically by treaty designed to be Indian territory. From the Cuyahoga River west above that line is supposed to be Indian territory. So when this congregation was formed, we were actually in stolen land, let's put it honestly. Anyway, they bought 5,000 acres, 800 people immigrated to America, and they called themselves the Ebenezer Society at that point. And eventually, they formed a number of villages in the area. There were 4 related villages. Now, they were very creative in the naming of these villages. Upper Ebenezer, Lower Ebenezer, Middle Ebenezer, and New Ebenezer. And then eventually, there were 2 additional villages on the Canadian side of the river, Canada Ebenezer and Kennenberg. They had their own constitution, which was 32 paragraphs long, and became the legal organization for the Amana Society in Iowa. It included provisions for the common ownership of property among the group. In other words, they became communal at this group. Before that, people had their own personal finances. There were rich and poor in the group. But after the Constitution in 1859, everything was held in common. It's significant that it was a document approved by the Lord. I mean, there was actually a testimony of the Werkzug that said God approved of this. And their communal existence was not because of biblical warrants. You know, we read in Acts 2 about how they held everything in common. That's not why this group held everything in common. It was because of the testimony of the Werkzug that they held everything in common. And in fact, when they broke up in 1932, it became a real source of religious tension for them because they had this testimony from somebody as authoritative as Moses that said you live communally, but they couldn't do it because of the depression. They began to prosper, but they had some problems with the Indians who didn't really want them there. That was one thing, but there was another problem, and that was Buffalo, New York. They saw it as a temptation for their youth. And so, under another testimony, they decided that they needed to move to the west. Initially, so they had another one of these episodes where they sent out, not spies, they sent out people to prepare the way. And they originally looked in Kansas, but eventually they found this place in Iowa, which we know as the Amana Colonies. They secured a tract of land initially of 18,000 acres in Iowa. Eventually, it wound up being 26,000 contiguous acres. That's about 50 square miles. So they were as big as a township in Ohio. Or not a township, a county in Ohio. As big as a county in Ohio. And that's when they took the name Amana. They were very deliberate in moving, and it wasn't until, this was like early 1850s, it wasn't until 1865 that everybody from Ebenezer got out there. Initially, they bought the village of Homestead, Lock, Stock, and Barrel, and then they had 6 additional villages, and again, Amana or Old Amana, West Amana, South Amana, East Amana, Middle Amana, and High Amana were the villages. The system of villages was laid out so all the villages were within easy walking distance of each other. They were all laid out so that they were in 6 miles of Old Amana. And this is a street scene. I'm going to begin to show some slides now. This is a street scene. I do not know the date of this photograph, but that's a street scene in one of the villages. Each village had between 40 and 100 houses, and since they took their meals communally, each village had several kitchen houses, and each kitchen house served about 40 persons. And the next slide. There we go. That's inside one of the kitchen houses. And I have another slide about the kitchen house. Oops, gotta go back. Okay. The kitchen houses were the responsibility of some of the women. Usually the younger women did the cooking. The older women took care of the kitchen gardens, which I'll show you in a minute. Or the middle-aged women took care of the gardens, and the oldest women took care of the small children during this time. Let's see here. Because everybody ate in the kitchen house, the residences were primarily sitting rooms and bedrooms. Sitting rooms and bedrooms. And as you saw from the first picture, the villages were very plain looking. They didn't believe in painting the buildings because they thought it was cheaper to replace rotten wood than it was to paint. And so everything was very, very plain. Everything was very, very plain. Oh, and it even got plainer because one of their Werkzeuge, a woman named Barbara Heinemann, had an inspiration that forbade the planting of ornamental trees because they had no useful purpose. I guess beauty has no purpose. Each village had its own school and church and necessary businesses like a bakery, a store, and a post office. Each had its own set of waterworks and a mill for sawing lumber into building material. There was a canal which ran through the Amana Colonies, and which they used to transport goods on. Christian Metz, who is probably the most significant figure in their whole history, died in 1867, just 2 years after they had finalized the move to Iowa. It's really primarily due to his theological and political leadership that they moved to America and then moved to Iowa. And at the high point of the community, they had about 800 persons in 1900. The Inspirationist community at Amana is organized around the principle of a strong central authority that was both spiritual and temporal. In addition to the instrument who spoke for God, who offered direction that was both spiritual and temporal in nature, there was a board of trustees called the Great Council that oversaw the affairs of the entire colonies. The members of the Great Council were elected annually, and each village had a governance of 7 elders. Now, you may wonder, they had no printing press, radio, text messaging, etc. The way in which everybody knew what was going on was that they had 11 worship services a week. And the elders at the end of each service would give them any news they needed to have. And in fact, the elders and the Mertzu determined what anybody in the Amana colonies knew about the outside world. Any news of the world only got in through what was said at these announcements at worship. Let me talk a little bit about some of the economic realities. Well, first of all, they needed to supply their own needs. So agriculture was an important part of it. The kitchen gardens were an important part of it. In fact, let me show you the kitchen gardens. Outside each one of these kitchen houses, there was a big garden. I think I have 2 pictures of that. No. They also had industries like this is a woolen mill. They became well-known and sold products nationally, calico and woolen products. And that was the primary enterprise that they had that garnered money for the communal living. They also had grain mills, and they had, for some reason, their grain was better than anybody else's grain. The flour was better than anybody else's flour, whatever. Work in Amana was very regimented. Everybody had a schedule from 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. they worked. There was a lunch break, and then from 1 to 6 you worked. And halfway through each of those work sessions, they had a little, well, we call it a coffee break, but they called it the lunch break. And the children were in school for the same hours as the adults. The children's school was 7 a.m. to 11 o'clock and 1 to 5, 6 days a week. 6 days a week. They eventually had to hire some help from outside the community, primarily to take care of some of the work on the farms. Let me show again. This is one of the kitchen gardens, and you can see they're toiling away at the vegetables. And this is one of the schools. It really looks very exciting, doesn't it? A lot of their lessons were basically rote recitation of the lessons they were to be given. Okay, I need to take a break from the pictures a minute and tell you the relationship between the sexes was very different than at Oneida. as you can imagine. Because things of the flesh were seen as antithetical to things of the spirit, marriage was discouraged, but it wasn't forbidden. If a couple wanted to get married, they would separate the couple, send one of them to a different village for a year. And if after a year they still wanted to get married, they were allowed to get married. But getting married demoted you spiritually in the community. Barbara Heinemann, who was one of the instruments, got married to a man named Landeman, and for 26 years she was no longer considered prophet. Now, after 26 years, somehow her prophecies became valid again. But if you got married, you were demoted. And every time you had a child, you were demoted spiritually. And the way in which your spiritual rank was determined, there were several ways, and I'll talk about one of them later, but one of the ways your spiritual rank was obvious to people was where you sat in worship. Those who were superior, those who were considered more spiritual, sat at the back of the sanctuary. So of course the children sat in the very front, because the assumption was as you got older, you should be more spiritually mature. So a couple gets married, they go to the front. They work their way back over the course of time. They have a child, they go back to the front, and they work their way back. So it was obvious to everybody in every church where you were spiritually on the hierarchy. One of the ways they determined where you were on the spiritual hierarchy is they had an annual examination of everybody in the village by the elders. And these things were excruciating. You had to confess all your faults. If they didn't think you were confessing your faults, you had to come back a second day for more examination. After they did these examinations, every 2 years they had what I would call a high communion. But it was after people went through these, people were terrified of the elders examining them. Think about mutual criticism at Oneida. It's the same kind of process where someone exterior to yourself examines you spiritually and determines how you're doing. Let's see here. Let me talk about children for a couple of minutes. The younger children were in a community daycare called a Kinderschule, which was the older women in the community took care of them. The school system had a regular schedule, as I said, but the day was broken down into 3 parts. One part was literacy, and the primary text was the Bible. Reading was allowed, but it was not encouraged. There was no such thing as recreational reading. The reading had to be something that was spiritually uplifting. So the children, that was the first third of their day. Then they had a play break, and then they had Arbeitsschule, which meant they learned a trade. In the Amana colonies, when you were 14 years old, that's pretty much when your schooling ended, the elders of the village determined what your role was going to be in the community. You did not choose to be a blacksmith, you were told to be a blacksmith. You did not choose to be a baker, you were told to be a baker. Contrast that with the way we do our lives. Contrast it with the way they did at Oneida, which was they rotated people through every kind of work thing so that they didn't get bored with it. In this structure, which was highly hierarchical, you were told what you were going to do. You were told what you were going to do. Let's see here. Oh, one of the things that children had to learn to do, they were knitting. Can you see their little hands knitting there?
Some had smiles and some.
What's that?
Some had smiles and some did not.
Not very much smiling, was there? Let me talk about the worship. This is one of the churches. Every village had their own church. Very plain. Nothing fancy. People sat on benches, and Marge and I went into one of the churches. The benches were not comfortable. I can't imagine the hours and hours that people sat on those benches year after year after year. In the worship, you see men coming out of the church here because the men and the women had separate entrances to go into the church. They sat, men on one side, women on the other, children in the front. And there were, as I said, 11 services a week for everybody, but they also had services based on your spiritual status. In other words, those who were the most spiritual had some worship times just them, etc. You got to humor me as I read you something about what children were taught, because it is 21 rules. 21 rules. And this is part of the way they reinforce the ethos here is to have such structure. Rule 1, obey without reasoning God and through God your superiors. Rule 2, study quiet or serenity within and without. Rule 3, within to rule and master your thoughts. 4, without to avoid all unnecessary words and still to study silence and quiet. 5, abandon self with all its desires, knowledge, and power. 6, do not criticize others, either for good or evil, neither to judge nor to imitate them. Therefore, contain yourself, remain at home in the house and in your heart. 7, do not disturb your serenity or peace of mind, hence neither desire nor grieve. Well, that's an interesting one. 8, live in love and pity toward your neighbor and indulge neither anger nor impatience in your spirit. 9, be honest, sincere, and avoid all deceit and even secretiveness. 10, count every word, thought, and work as done in the immediate presence of God, in sleeping and waking, eating, drinking, etc., and give him at once an account of it, to see if all is done in his fear and love. I'm only halfway through. 11, be in all things sober, without levity or laughter, and without vain and idle words, works, or thoughts. 12, never think or speak of God without the deepest reverence, fear, and love, and therefore deal reverently with all spiritual things. 13, bear all inner and outward sufferings in silence, complaining only to God, and accept all from him in deepest reverence and obedience. 14, notice carefully all that God permits to happen to you in your inner and outward life, in order that you may not fail to comprehend his will and be led by it. 15, have nothing to do with unholy and particularly with needless business affairs. 16, have no intercourse with world-minded men, never seek their society, speak little with them, and never without need, and then not without fear and trembling. They never talk to an outsider. They can't be trusted, you see. 18, fly from the society of womankind as much as possible. And I love this last phrase, as a very highly dangerous magnet and magical fire. 19, avoid obeisance and fear of men. These are dangerous ways. 20, dinners, weddings, feasts, avoid entirely. At the best, there is sin. And 21, constantly practice abstinence and temperance, so that you may be as wakeful after eating as before. Now, those were the rules that people lived by. Magical fire. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to stop the text here and just show you some pictures of some of the scenes here. This is a procession to a wedding. Looks real cheery, doesn't it? This is gathering ice, I suppose, to keep the beer cold. This is, I don't know what these guys are doing, but they have an ox cart. That's a baker. Blacksmith. That's working in the fields. Now, agricultural work was hard in those days. It was very difficult. Not just for the humans, but for the ox as well. Now, this is an important picture because I said that they take all their meals communally. What happens when somebody gets sick? Someone takes the food to them while they're recovering. Everybody else, though, eats at the kitchen house. So, this is a family. Aren't they a happy group? Often when people got married, they would move into living arrangements that were associated with the older generation. And here you see at least 3 generations. The little boy, I don't know how many relatives there are in this picture, but this is a family. This is a winter scene.
It was a mild winter.
And I think that's the last picture. Yeah, it is. Okay. As I mentioned, they divided themselves into hierarchies of spiritual order. I have to tell this story. When you did something bad, you got excluded from worship. This was, this was a shunning experience. And I want to read you, an old woman wrote about her childhood there, and she remembers being punished for an offense. 2 of us girls went down to watch the baseball game. Amana boys were playing some team from outside, and baseball was not allowed. The 2 of us girls went down to watch the baseball game. The Amana boys were playing an outside team. Of course, it was illegal, the playing and the watching, and we knew we would be excommunicated for at least several weeks if we were caught. But we took the chance, and we were caught. I suppose we felt we were doing something very wicked. It's a different style of life, isn't it? I talked about the annual examination, so I won't pull that. I think I've covered pretty much other questions you have that about this community. When you take a look at the question sheet I had, you can see how differently it is possible to organize a religious community. There are very different assumptions which underlie the structure of the community and how it was structured. Yes?
What was wrong with laughter?
I do not know exactly what's wrong with laughter, but I suppose well, we come into church and we talk to people, Roman Catholics go into church and they kneel and pray for, I suppose it seems irreverent in some way. I don't know.
I mean, I have a sign on my refrigerator, a day without laughter is a day wasted. I mean, I didn't
That's
know
our
how wicked I
perspective.
was.
That's our perspective.
Oh, we know.
Their perspective would be a day with laughter is something to confess during the examination each year.
Well, and there's some things, you know, as you went along that were similar to some of the Amish, you know, things, but there's a lot of
Well,
laughter. in
I think
Amish.
as somebody looking at this group from the outside would say, oh, well, that reminds me of the Amish.
Yeah.
But they are not Amish. It's a very different culture and a very different kind of structure. And their worship, the worship life of this community is hard to picture for us. If you go to church 11 times, everybody goes to church 11 times a week, and those who are superior, have other worship times. People are worshiping a lot. Their worship services tended to be, first of all, there was reading of scripture, there was prayer, both spoken and silent, and there was not only reading of scripture, but reading of the writings of the Versu, those prophets in their midst. And then at the end of the time of worship, the elders would make any announcements that were required. So people were spending a lot of time in worship.
How did they fit in 11 worship services with all this working 6 days a
Well,
week?
there was one every single night. There was one Sunday morning that gets you up to 8. And there were several other ones that were special. But when I think of being on those benches 11 times a week, they were not designed for comfort. I think they were designed for to chastise you. Yeah.
The services were probably longer than an hour.
Pardon?
The services were
Probably.
probably longer than an
I mean,
hour.
what are you going to do in the evening if you're not allowed to read books? You're going to go to worship in the
Oh,
evening.
no, that's something.
Yeah.
Well, you said that it ended during the Depression, and
Right.
so was that lack of resources, or what?
I don't really understand what was going on that caused them to have to give up communal existence, but I have to believe in the 19th century, early 20th century, their sale of calico and woolen goods was a primary outside income. People did not generally go outside, and these things were marketed nationally. People did not leave the community for work of other kinds. The only people who left the community and got any kind of schooling beyond is if they needed a new doctor, someone was sent to someplace to be educated as a doctor, but they were self-contained. So, and I don't know why they had to give up the communal meals. I'm assuming the gardens still produce food,
Yeah.
but for some reason, the economy collapsed. It's hard for us, I think, to picture what the Depression is like because we didn't live through it, but they gave up their communities there.
Was there any mention of music?
The singing, there was singing of hymns in worship without accompaniment. Without accompaniment. No music other than that though.
Two things. Was the canal connected to a longer canal system or river system?
I have no idea.
And Iowa is not exactly known for
Yeah.
trees and building materials.
Well, it isn't, but I did read someplace that during World War I, now remember, they don't want to deal with the outside world. I think it was to prevent problems. They gave up a lot of lumber for strategic purposes to the government. So if they had woodlots,
So they must have had trees.
they must have had some woodlots as well.
There were a lot of brick buildings as well.
There were brick buildings as well. Interestingly, one of the things about working in Amana from 7 to 11 and 1 to 6 was that they took pride in doing their work well, not speedily. A project they had to hire outside bricklayers for. The foreman discovered, oh, by the way, the work foremen were also one of the structures that reinforced the ethos of the community. The foreman discovered that the Amana guys only could lay 2/3 the amount of bricks that a commercial bricklayer was like, because people were very careful about the way they did their work. But
So getting to Iowa kind of coincides with the end of the Civil War. Was there some reasoning in that, or?
no, it was the wickedness of Buffalo. The wickedness
Well,
of Buffalo. One of the things I found interesting, I think I mentioned this last week, while there is a family structure, you know, the community is central to what's going on. That's the communal meal part of it. But also, I wanted to see Barbara Heinemann's grave. The only way you can find a grave is if you know the date of their death, because there are no family plots in the cemetery there. You're buried sequentially by the date of your death. And up until 1917, all of the gravestones, absolutely, the Werkzug's gravestone is the same as everybody else's, and it's in German. In 1917, they began putting them in English, probably because of war. Any other thoughts?
How were the instruments or prophets like chosen or determined that they could do this?
That became the elders to determine whether or not what they're speaking is faithful to God's intention, etc. And as I said, Barbara Heinemann was devoted for 26 years because she got married. But now I want you to think for a few minutes not about Amana, but about us and how we enforce our culture. How do we enforce our culture, the Methodist culture? If there is such a thing.
Well, that's
Is there
my
such a
first
thing?
question is, do we have a
Do we
culture,
have a culture?
any different from the rest of the community?
What, answer the question. Do you? What would you say our culture is?
Well, part of it is, in my head at least, is we have a separation between church and state, which is conduct versus spiritual beliefs, I think. So that I'm not sure we would enforce our culture the same way that community did, because they were both government and.
Right, but their culture is that there is church, but there's no state. I mean, they have no relationship to
Yeah.
the state of Iowa. I mean, they prefer to be separated. I mean, in that sense, there is a sense that they're like Amish in that regard. I would say that United Methodists are very integrated into public. I mean, we talk about public issues around education and
Social issues.
social issues,
Okay.
And
social
we're not
welfare.
self-contained either.
Pardon?
We're not self-contained.
No, we're not self-contained. And the boundaries which keep us who we are and separate us from the outside are very porous. In this, in Amana, the boundary between who's in the community and who's outside the community is very strict. We have a very porous boundary. There are some of us who come to worship every week. And then we have people on our rolls that a new pastor comes and says, who is that person? Because they've never seen them before. One of the interesting, I did this study with a congregation in the late 1997. And one of the issues was, what do you do to get into a community of faith, and what gets you thrown out of a community of faith? And the conclusion that was reached is that you could virtually do nothing to get thrown out. What do you think you could be thrown out of the church for here? If you were a member here, what would you do? What could you do that would get you tossed. I mean, these girls watched a baseball game and they got excommunicated for weeks.
Well, for starters,
That
I
was
think it
all
would,
true.
would relate to your relationship with the church in the sense of, suppose you stole the weekly offering, that might,
Let's suppose, okay, there are cases where, a church treasurer's walked off with the money, okay? Would there be an actual action to remove their membership?
probably not. Just put them in jail.
Maybe removed physically from the premises, yeah.
Yeah, it's a complex question.
Actually, David, the only ones that I can think that were removed from the community were ministers. You know,
Their
now
status is
through-
changed, their status is, you can defrock a pastor,
Right.
but I don't think you can say, I don't know of a case where somebody says, you're no longer a United Methodist, you're just not, you're no longer a United Methodist pastor.
They were taken out of this community. They were taken out of this community, put in another
Oh.
community,
Oh,
you know, so from that standpoint of view, but I don't know of anybody else. Well, maybe there's been some music leaders and stuff that have been not taken out of the community, but encouraged not to be here.
They're just.
in other words, their role is not honored, they're thrown out of their role in the community.
Right.
But they're not,
Otherwise.
are they Xed off the roles?
But they're not necessarily, they were excommunicated.
Right.
But that, taking out of the roles kind of encouraged them to go someplace else.
And how do we get on the rolls here? Here, in the communal setting, you give up everything you have to become part of the community. Basically, we stand in front of the church and say yes to several vows and we're in.
We don't even have to take a test.
I guess, I'm raising the question is, do you think we ought to have some standards?
Well, to your point, or your question, all of these communities had elite groups who were the judges of who belonged and who
Right.
didn't belong, and whose conduct was good and who's bad. I think that's inappropriate in a congregation where you're trying to be open to everyone.
Right.
And who decides who the elite people are that would have that judgment? I think we're past that.
Well, I don't think we're past it in the sense that I think that inside community faith, people can shun others. It's not as though that they are thrown out of the group, but they can be shunned by others. I'm trying to think of an example.
I
Yeah.
would say, our safe sanctuaries guidelines, you know, we have guidelines for how people can be, how involved people can be in the church in terms of, specifically working with vulnerable populations, and if those, you know, it's a, you know, document and signed and all those things, and if those are broken, then the way that you're involved in the community at least
Is restricted.
is restricted.
Right.
I don't know.
So there are some boundaries for protection of people.
Sure.
I'm not suggesting that we ought to be throwing people out of the church, but I want to tell you a story. The United Methodist Church used to set its apportionments in East Ohio based 2/3 on the amount that the church spent on itself and 1/3 based on the membership. And so the expectation, it was actually an obligation every year, was to review the membership rolls and to, those who were inactive were to be contacted, et cetera, and often asked, do you want to continue your membership? Because they showed no interest in participating in any kind of way. And long ago, thankfully, we removed that apportionment issue changed that apportionment issue because there was a motivation inside congregations to prune the rolls. Because it costs money to have people on the rolls. And I remember one congregation I served, after a survey of those who were inactive, a letter was sent to the people that were inactive to ask if they wanted to continue their membership and to encourage them to become active again. And as pastor, I signed those letters. I wasn't the only one involved in that process. But there was a teenage girl who was in college who was devastated when she got that letter saying, do you want to continue as a member of the church? She became a friend of one of my daughters, and she's married now and is a band director in a school district in Cuyahoga County. And she still talks about how traumatic it was to get that letter from the pastor saying, you've been inactive, do you really want to stay a member?
There were situations like that, yeah, that was a big deal, pruning the rolls at one time.
Right, right. Pruning the rolls. I had a retired pastor help me in one congregation with that process, and it was a totally negative process, One day he had visited some folks we were inquiring about their interest in continuing, and it was so upsetting to him, the conversations he had, I had to send him home. I thought he was gonna have a stroke. Yeah. So I guess we do have some boundary issues, but not like this community had boundary issues. Yes?
This denomination just went through a process of, that seemed to hinge on sexual preferences kind of issues. Were there any of those kind of racial and sexual preferences issues in these communities?
Well, this community.
I mean, it seems obvious that they were all white. But...
Right, well, it was a homogeneous group. They were, by choice, German pietists. And so there was no diversity in the group, really, at all. So that wasn't an issue for them. I think the issue is, it was a big issue, you didn't associate with people outside the community. If somebody in the Amana community, well, that girl who went to watch the baseball game, they were fraternizing with people outside the community. So that was a violation. Yeah.
So if they weren't to interact with people outside the community and
There were only the people who acted outside the community were the Werkzug and the Great Council. They decided what kind of relationship they had in terms of selling stuff away from the community. They're the ones that did the contracting and all that kind of stuff.
Could new people join? Or because if they discouraged
I know
reproduction as well.
I know of no proselytizing.
Okay.
I think it was the new people in the community were the babies,
Okay, which they didn't really encourage.
which they didn't, well, they still haven't.
Yeah,
But they
right,
had,
right.
they had ways to enforce family size because families that had 7 or 8 children, which wouldn't have been uncommon in the late 19th
Right,
century, they referred to them as rabbit families.
Oh.
They had many children. Yeah. But I do think one of the things very different in our culture is choosing a vocation. And you've all known teenagers that struggle with, what am I going to do with my life? And you know, am I going to go to school? Am I going to go in the military? Am I going to do what? You know, it was determined. The elders sat down and said, "You're a blacksmith. You're a baker. You're a farm worker. You're a bricklayer."
Do you think that new Reformation folks and the evangelical communities are more toward these kind of groups than toward, say, our group?
Well, they're different. In terms of the new apostolic reformation, they're self-validating prophets. I mean, you and I have joked about this. We ought to be the apostle to something. You know, the woman who said, I'm the apostle to Wyoming, I think it was, the state that she was
Or
going to.
Shreve could be a
Apostle to Shreve.
Set your hopes a little higher.
So, that hinges on where authority comes from too. You know, we talked last week about, compared to Oneida and compared to this society, our decision-making authority is very diffuse in this congregation. And deciding what God wants of us involves a lot of people, not a prophet, not a cult leader, but those of us around the table, and some might not agree, you know. It's just a different way that the community is organized. Now, we are going to, the last week I'm going to do is going to be on the Methodist class meeting, which was a perfectionist group. The people in the class meeting were, they were seeking to go on to perfection in God's eyes. And that's what these people were trying to do, was to be perfect in God's eyes, and that's what those 21 rules were about, especially the magical fire thing. In the Methodist class meeting, you could be, there were boundaries. There were boundaries and expectations. It's interesting that the origin of the class meeting began to pay off a debt, and it turned into a spiritual formation group. The first class meeting was led, the class leader, they had to pay down a debt on a building, and he said, let me go around and collect a penny from everybody in the group every week, and if they don't have a penny, I'll put it in myself. And that started the process that became eventually the class meeting I'm going to talk about, which is basically a spiritual formation group, especially before 1850. And it was very structured, very structured. We had class meetings in this congregation in the 1800s too. I went back through records when we did the bicentennial celebration here. And by the 1880s, the attendance at class meetings was about 50%, which would never have happened earlier in the class meeting process because there was enforcement of participation, self-examination, group discussion, etc. But that structure began to fall apart in the late 1800s.
You mentioned last week that there were 200, of these kinds of groups, at one time.
Right, 221 in the 19th century.
Were they aware of each other, or were they totally independent?
I honestly don't know. Most of these groups became self-contained groups on their own initiative. I mean, these folks were German pietists that were struggling against German society in a way. I won't take an oath to the state, I won't do military service, I won't send my kids to your school. And in the case of Oneida, they wanted to form a group that was distinct from the rest of the community, and they were distinct from the rest of the community. Ellen?
Could the people change jobs? You're gonna be
I
a
don't-
baker,
I
will I
don't-
get tired of that
I
after
don't
10
think
years?
so. I think you were stuck.
That's fine.
Your future was determined.
What if I started putting
And
poison?
on one level, I mean, somebody like, if I were put in that position, I'd leave. But there is one level of peace not having to face vocational issues. Because I know people that have struggled with vocational issues and it's tearing them apart. It's pretty simple when somebody says, you're gonna be the baker.
Mhm.
And I hope you like bread. Are any other questions on that sheet? Interesting to think about. I don't have that sheet in front of me. are we doing time-wise? What time is it?
First after 11.
It's after 11? I think we're, unless somebody else has a question or a comment they want to make. The group I'm going to be talking about next week are the Shakers. Also, very distinctly different than other groups. I believe there is one Shaker living still in New Hampshire, one. But it's hard to consider them a group. So, we'll talk about that. The week after that, we'll talk about Koinonia Farm, which is a group that's still in existence. And the final week, we'll talk about the Methodist class meeting and the way its culture was. So, anyway, thank you for your attention.
Thank you.